They say the sharpest knife isn't in the kitchen. It's in your own family's hands, hidden behind a smile. I thought I was walking into my granddaughter Emily's 9th birthday, but instead I stepped straight into a trap, 3 years and $152,000 in the making. The house smelled of grilled meat and frosted cake, but the moment Emily tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Grandpa, tonight my parents plan to take your money," every candle on that cake felt like a warning flare. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Your support is what lets me share the truths most families would rather bury. I sat in my car after the party, the engine cold, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. Outside, Oregon's spring air was crisp, and the pines whispered in the dark. But inside that old sedan, all I could hear was Emily's trembling voice. "Grandpa, tonight my parents plan to take your money." The sound of her words clung to me like smoke. For years I had been telling myself that family was a shelter, that love covered weakness. Yet now, staring at the quiet street outside David's suburban mansion, I felt like I had been blindfolded for too long. Every bill, every transfer, every check I had written began to march through my memory like a grim parade. $40,000, when David swore his house was about to be foreclosed. $8,500, when Julia cried over a broken transmission. $22,000 in tuition for Emily's private school, because our child deserves better. I never argued, never asked questions. I told myself it was what a father does, what a grandfather must do. But sitting there with the faint smell of birthday candles still clinging to my clothes, I saw it differently. That money wasn't generosity. It was my pension, my safety net, my retirement house built one receipt at a time. Every withdrawal was a brick removed from the wall I thought would protect me in old age. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and felt the weight of Ellen Sepp's voice echoing from the hospital bed 3 years ago. Her hand had been cool in mine, her breath shallow. "Greg, take care of Emily, but watch David. He's Sepp's weak." At the time I kissed her hand and told her not to worry. I believed love would be enough to carry him. Now I wondered if she had seen something in him I refused to admit. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m. Guests would still be laughing back at the house, glasses of wine half empty. Julia would be floating in her red dress, smiling as if nothing were wrong. And David, my only son, would be staring at his watch, already planning his next move. I wanted to tell myself Emily had misheard. Children catch fragments of adult conversations and twist them into fears, but my gut knew better. That little girl's eyes had been wide with a fear beyond her 9 years. She wasn't lying. She was warning me. And the truth was, I had been seeing signs for months. Julia's too sweet smile when she visited me last February, her casual remark, "Father Gregory, this house is too big for you alone. There are excellent nursing homes where you'd have company. No chores, no worries." At the time, I laughed it off. Tonight, it sounded like part of a plan. My chest tightened. For the first time in 72 years, I felt not old, but hunted. Betrayal is heavier than age. I thought of the old safe in my study, the one that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were contracts, saving slips, tax records. Ellen used to tease me for keeping every scrap of paper, every receipt, as if I was building a museum of numbers. But now I realized those papers might be my only weapons. The night air seeped through the cracked window, carrying the faint scent of rain. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I couldn't storm back into the house and confront them. Accusations without proof only turned suspicion into weakness. I had run a construction company for 4 decades. I knew one truth: before you tear down a wall, you study its foundation. I turned the key in the ignition, but didn't drive. Instead, I whispered into the dark car, "Ellen, I feel protect Emily. And if David really is weak enough to let Julia lead him into this, then I feel stop them both." When I finally pulled into my driveway, it was past 11. The house was quiet, the roses Ellen planted by the porch heavy with dew. I paused by the photo in the hall. Ellen smiling on our wedding day, her eyes full of light. "You warned me," I muttered. "Now I have to see the truth for myself." I climbed the stairs, body aching, but my mind refused to rest. Betrayal wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a seed planted, and I knew it would grow. The only question was whether I'd let it grow wild, or whether I'd take shears to it before it poisoned everything. That night, I barely slept. The sheets felt heavy, my chest tighter with each breath. Somewhere between the ticks of the clock, I made a vow. Tomorrow I'd begin. I'd gather every scrap of proof, every receipt, every whisper of truth. And if my own son and his wife really were plotting to strip me bare, then they'd discover that Gregory Hale was not a man who yielded easily. Because I may be old, but I'm not done fighting. The next morning, Oregon sunlight poured through my curtains, too bright for the weight I carried in my chest. My coffee went cold on the table as I replayed Emily's whisper again and again. Betrayal doesn't just wound you, it makes you question the ground you stand on, and I needed solid ground if I was going to face what lay ahead. By mid-morning I stepped outside to water Ellen's roses. The iron gate creaked, and Dorothy, my neighbor of 20 years, called out from across the street. She carried a paper bag from the bookstore, her straw hat tilted against the sun. "Greg, I ran into David and Julia downtown last week," she said lightly. They looked serious, carrying some thick folders from the bank. Must be important paperwork. Her words hit like a hammer. I smiled, forced casual, and thanked her. But inside, I froze. Bank paperwork. David hadn't mentioned a thing to me. The pit in my stomach widened. After Dorothy left, I stood staring at those roses, remembering the checks I'd written over the past 3 years, a foreclosure notice I paid off, a medical bill Julia said was urgent, tuition invoices I covered without blinking. My pen had always been too quick, my questions too slow, and now the bank folders made sense. They weren't planning for Emily's future, they were planning to strip mine. That afternoon, I picked up the phone and invited David to lunch at our old diner on 6th Street. It was where we used to go when he was a boy, him ordering pancakes, me bacon and eggs. But his voice on the line was awkward, strained. Dad, I'm busy with work. Maybe another day." And then I heard Julia in the background, sharp and dismissive. "Tell him to do it tomorrow. Today's not convenient." It was like a curtain pulled back. The last time David refused a meal with me so bluntly, he was 16, sulking after I caught him sneaking money from Ellen's purse. Back then, I grounded him. Now, I only felt my suspicion harden. That evening, I drove into town and parked near the shopping district. And there they were, David and Julia, walking out of First National Bank. David clutched a black leather briefcase. Julia leaned in, whispering something, and they hurried to their car. They didn't see me. I sat in my sedan, hands tight on the wheel, a stone settling deeper in my chest. When I got home, I walked straight into my study. The house was quiet, the air heavy. I pulled out the key, unlocked the old oak cabinet, and dragged the safe into the light. My fingers trembled as I spun the combination. Ellen's birth date, March 14th. With a soft click, it opened. Inside lay decades of my life, contracts from Hale & Sons Construction, tax slips, envelopes fat with receipts. I carried them to the desk, spread them out under the lamplight. At first, I only intended to glance through a few, but as the papers stacked, the pattern grew unmistakable. Here was the $40,000 check from 2020, David's house in Eugene. Here, the $8,500 invoice from the auto shop, Julia's urgent repair. The $22,000 tuition receipt for Emily's school. The medical bill, $12,000, no details, just Julia's voice trembling on the phone. One by one, I laid them in order. When I added the numbers, my hand paused over the page. $152,000. Gone in 3 years. I felt the air leave my lungs. I thought of Ellen's voice again. Watch David. She had known. And I had been too proud, too hopeful to admit it. I took a yellow legal pad, drew 4 columns. Date, amount, reason. Who asked? Then I began writing. It was no longer just scraps of paper. It was evidence. I stayed at that desk past midnight, my coffee gone bitter, my pen digging into the paper. Every line was a betrayal spelled out in ink. Every figure a reminder that I hadn't just been generous, I had been manipulated. Yet even as anger flared, I felt something else rise. Clarity. My life in construction taught me that cracks, left unfixed, bring down the whole house. And this house, my family, was already cracking. By 1 in the morning, the ledger lay thick with numbers. I closed it, slid it into a drawer, and whispered to Ellen Sept's photo on the shelf. You told me to watch. Now I will, and I won Sept. Just watch. I Sept, prepare. Because if David and Julia truly thought they could bind me with paperwork, then I'd meet them with paperwork of my own. That night, as the house settled around me, I realized suspicion had become certainty, and certainty demands action. Saturday morning, the air smelled of wet cedar. I had barely slept, but my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. Betrayal has a way of sobering a man, stripping away illusions. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Julia stood there, holding a basket of croissants, as if she were the picture of sweetness. Steam rose from the bag, her lipstick bright in the morning sun. Father Gregory, I baked these fresh. Thought you might like them. I stepped aside and let her in, but I watched her eyes. She wasn't looking at me. She was scanning my living room, my bookshelves, the staircase, taking inventory like a realtor sizing up a house she already planned to sell. We sat at the glass table. She slid the basket across, her smile never slipping. You live alone. It must be a lot, keeping this house. David and I have been thinking of ways to spare you the small chores. Her tone was syrup, but the urgency behind her eyes told the real story. Before I could reply, David walked in. His face was set, not hesitant like before, but rehearsed. He carried a leather folder and placed it on the table with ceremony. Dad, we're here to talk seriously. There are things we need to get done before matters get messy. What things? I asked, my voice level. He glanced at Julia. Then, as if reciting lines, he said, We just prepared some financial management paperwork, a power of attorney. It still let us pay your bills, handle medical care, take the stress off your shoulders. Julia leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. You only need to sign, Dad. We sip even spoken to a notary. Everything will be simple and safe. I lifted the folder, flipped through the first pages. The clauses were blunt, full authority over all financial assets. Agents may act without court oversight. Nearly every sentence handed them power I had built over 70 years. My hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, from recognition. This was no accident. This was their endgame. I closed the folder slowly and set it down. I understand your point, I said, but I'm tired today. Let me rest. Tomorrow we and I read every page carefully. David Sepp's voice pressed harder. Just one signature, Dad. It won't take a minute. I smiled faintly. Tomorrow. They exchanged a look. Julia's lips twitched with disappointment, but she covered it with a smile. David sighed. They stood, leaving the folder neatly on the table. And the door shut. I sat alone with the leather binder. I opened it again, reading each clause under the lamplight. My breath slowed. They thought they were clever, pressure me with my age, sprinkle in reminders of small mistakes, then slide a document across before I could blink. But what they hadn't counted on was my training. I'd spent 40 years in boardrooms, parsing contracts where one misplaced comma could cost millions. I knew this game, and I knew how to turn it. I slipped the binder into a drawer, locked it, and walked to the study. There, under Ellen Sipp's photo, I wrote a note in my ledger. Contact Karen Davis, notary. Call Samuel at First National Bank. Begin building counterfile. I underlined the last 3 words twice. Counterfile. That night, I laid out my evidence again. The $40,000 check for David's house, the $8,500 car repair slip, the $22,000 tuition bill. Each one I copied carefully, tucking duplicates into a separate folder. Piece by piece, I was building a wall against them, a wall of paper they would never climb. I sat back, the clock striking midnight. My house was silent, but my heart beat steady, no longer from panic, but from resolve. They thought they were setting a trap. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent my life building foundations, and I was already pouring the concrete of their downfall. By dawn, I was ready. The board was set, the pieces in motion. If David and Julia wanted a game of signatures, I would give them one. But the final page they witnessed me sign would not hand them control. It would bury their scheme in the light of truth. I called Karen the next morning before the sun had fully climbed. Karen Davis had been a notary for 27 years in Eugene. No-nonsense, crisp voice, the kind of woman who'd seen people sign away everything and later wish they could unsign it. I knew the notary's ledger mattered. A practiced witness is not a rumor. When I explained, I didn't spill everything at once. I described only enough pressure, a rush signature, an offer that takes the worry away. I listened to her breathe on the line, then said plainly, "Karen, would you come by the house this week? I need a neighborly visitor, and if anything looks off, I want you to be present." She didn't hesitate. "Greg, I'll be there Thursday at 10. I'll bring my ledger." That small piece of paper, her ledger, felt heavier than any brick I'd ever lifted. Next was Samuel, at First National. I'd known Samuel by reputation, deputy director, precise, the sort who kept a tidy file on even the quietest customers. He and I had exchanged pleasantries at local charity events, but we'd never been close. I called and spoke plainly. I needed confirmation about a bank inquiry, nothing more. I didn't use the words guardianship yet. I wanted to draw him in without scaring him off. 2 days later, Samuel met me at the bank in his small, windowed office. He slid a thin folder across the desk as if he'd been waiting for me. "Mr. Hale," he said, voice steady. "We had inquiries. A couple of weeks ago, your son and his wife asked about emergency guardianship procedures and the paperwork involved." He didn't lecture, he stated fact. My throat tightened. A plan that used legal procedure to paint me as incapable, that was the kind of trap that could look legitimate to half the family and cruel to the other half. Samuel agreed to observe and corroborate. He'd sit with me if I needed him at a signing, and he agreed to provide any bank records that supported my case without violating privacy, of course, but enough to show a pattern of behavior. "We don't like seeing family disputes enter the bank," he said. "I'll make a note." His wording pleased me more than I expected. A bank record is not gossip. It carries weight in a room full of relatives. With Karen's ledger and Samuel's quiet confirmation, my counterfile was becoming less a private obsession and more a paper fortress. Each ally I recruited had professional weight: a notary who could say a signature was coerced, a bank officer who could trace the inquiries. Together they would turn insinuation into evidence. I spent the days that followed moving like a man on a scaffold, methodical, deliberate. I copied receipts, scanned them, and tucked originals into the safe again. I photocopied the $40,000 check, the $8,500 repair invoice, the tuition receipt for $22,000, and the vague $12,000 medical payment with no provider listed. I wrote notes in the margins: who asked, when asked, what story was told. The ledger grew thicker. Each entry read like a small betrayal. May 12th, $8,500, car transmission asked by Julia, urgent. At the same time, I began small surgical moves in public. I invited neighbors over for tea: Dorothy, Mrs. Phelps from across the street, and a couple who'd come to our block parties for years. I spoke gently about how careful one must be with paperwork, about how signatures bind you in ways words do not. I didn't accuse. I planted seeds. People began to remember small oddities: David's sudden bank visits, Julia's offhand suggestions about nursing homes. Those memories, once nudged awake, would later join the proof. I also hired a quiet private investigator, not for dirt, but for a simple fact check: bank visit dates, who accompanied whom, whether any paperwork had been handed to legal counsel. I was careful. No illegal trickery. Just a man who knew how to follow a paper trail. The PI provided a short report. David and Julia had visited First National twice in the past 6 weeks, always after business hours, always clutching folders. That detail alone told a story: secrecy. I added that report to my folder. And because I wanted the moral high ground, I retained a small, reputable elder care attorney to review any documents I was handed. Her name was Lillian, gray-haired and brisk, who traveled the circuit of elder law clinics and had a soft way of explaining hard legal truths. I asked her an innocent question: If someone is pressured to sign, what protections are there? She answered with statutory detail and a look that warned the greedy without scolding the elderly. She agreed to be on call to review any power of attorney presented on my behalf. As the week passed, Julia's behavior became more volatile. She stopped with the casual charm and started with the urgency. You should really consider downsizing, she told me once, while dusting a photo on the mantel, her fingers lingering like a surveyor mapping property lines. It's a lot for one person. We could handle utilities for you. At times she was companionable. At others she was a woman pacing the edge of a plan. David kept calling, sometimes pleading about overdue notices, sometimes trying to use humor to smooth the edges. His voice wavered like a man who'd been told too many stories that weren't true. I kept my cool. I listened. I recorded small moments in my ledger dates. Words, the way Julia's smile didn't reach her eyes. My heart thudded less with fear and more with planning. I was gathering not just paper but witnesses, patterns, corroboration. When Thursday morning arrived, Karen came with her ledger tucked under her arm and a quiet determination in her walk. She sat at my kitchen table, looked at my notes, and didn't flinch. "We'll be careful," she said simply. "We'll watch for pressure. If they rush you, call me." Her presence felt like a legal flashlight, ready to expose whatever shadows they tried to hide behind. By the end of the week, my counterfile wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the truth. And truth, unlike a friendly lie, doesn't need to shout to be heard. It simply waits until the right doors open, then steps in. I slept with a new kind of tired that night. Not the exhaustion of an old man's bones, but the purposeful fatigue of a man who had taken up a task and would see it through. The trap they thought they'd laid was starting to look less like their victory, and more like a stage set waiting for the curtain to fall. By June, the weight of their desperation seeped into every conversation. Summer in Oregon had arrived, the air heavy with pine resin and the faint smoke of backyard grills. But in my house, the heat came from somewhere else. Julia and David's debts had begun pressing like storm clouds, and I could see the cracks spreading in their calm. The first sign came on a Tuesday afternoon when I stopped by unannounced. Emily had left her school jacket at my place, and I thought I'd surprise her. Instead, I walked into a silence so thick I nearly turned back. From the hallway I heard Julia's voice, sharp as a blade. "Do you understand, David? If he rewrites the will, we still have nothing. Nothing. The mortgage is already 3 months overdue. The credit card company keeps calling about the $40,000 we owe, and last year's Seps's hospital bill is still sitting there like a noose." David Sepp's reply was weaker, softer, but just as frantic. "I know, Julia. But Dad, Sepp's right. The amounts are too much already. Maybe it's Sepp's time we—" "Time we what?" Julia snapped. "Start over like broke newlyweds? Don't sit naive. This is the only chance. You know his weakness." I held my breath against the doorframe. David Sepp's voice wavered. "What weakness?" Julia didn't hesitate. "Emily, he said'll do anything for that child. If he won set sign for us, then we use her boarding school in Seattle. Out of reach. He said'll fold rather than lose her." I felt my chest constrict, my pulse roaring in my ears. My Emily, the only innocent in this storm, was to be turned into a weapon. I pulled back quietly, left the jacket on the porch rail, and walked away before they could see me. That night, I sat in my study with the ledger open, staring at the neat columns of figures. My hand shook as I added a new line. Threatened to use Emily as leverage, June 4. I underlined it twice, then shut the book with a force that rattled the lamp. They had crossed a line. And yet, when David called 2 nights later, his voice sounded almost gentle. "Dad, we sit like to have you over soon. Just family matters, long-term planning, nothing big, maybe at the house, with everyone there." His tone was rehearsed, his words meant to soothe, but the tremor underneath told me he was cornered. I agreed, my voice calm, but my mind was already racing. If they wanted a performance, I would give them one, but it would be my stage. The following week, Julia came by again. This time she didn't bother with croissants. She sat on my sofa, legs crossed, eyes steady. "Father Gregory, you can't keep dodging this. It's not about you anymore. It's about what happens when you're gone. If you really care about Emily, you'll let us take care of things." I met her gaze evenly. "I settle sign, Julia," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "But only when the whole family is present. Everyone should witness such an important moment." She blinked, surprised, then smiled like a fox, finding an open coop. "That sip's wise. We settle arrange it." When she left, I sat down at my desk and opened a different folder. Inside was the revised will, drafted with Lillian, the elder care attorney I'd quietly retained. Every asset, every account, every parcel of land would bypass David and Julia entirely and funnel straight into a trust for Emily. Management rights sealed away from greedy hands. It wasn't revenge, it was protection. Still, the days that followed tested my patience. Julia's tone grew sharper in phone calls, her words coated in honey but spiked with steel. David avoided me altogether, ashamed or unwilling to look me in the eye. And Emily, poor Emily, when she came to visit, she clung to me longer than usual, her small arms around my neck. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" she whispered once. I kissed her hair and told her I was fine. But inside I was already preparing for battle. By mid-June, the invitations had gone out. A family gathering, a milestone dinner, everyone to witness what they believed would be my surrender. Julia spoke of it with pride to anyone who would listen. From now on, Father Gregory won't have to worry about anything. We still shoulder it. I watched her from across rooms, her laugh too loud, her eyes too quick. David followed behind her like a shadow weighed down by debt, conscience, and fear. I meanwhile spent each night rehearsing in silence. I pictured the long table, the faces of relatives, the pen in my hand. I imagined the hush when Karen read the clauses aloud, the rustle when Samuel laid out the bank records. I imagined Emily standing small but steady, her voice confirming what she had overheard. Every construction project begins with a blueprint, and by now, my blueprint for their downfall was nearly complete. The only thing left was to wait for the right day, the right stage, and the right silence before the reveal. Until then, I played my part, smiling faintly, nodding at Julia's chatter, letting David believe his persuasion was working. They thought I was yielding. In truth, I was tightening the screws. Because the higher you build a lie, the harder it collapses when the foundation is cut. July in Oregon can be deceptive. The evenings stay light, soft golden against the pines, and neighbors laugh on porches with glasses of iced tea. To the outside eye, it looks like the world is steady, calm, whole. But inside my chest, I carried a storm. For weeks, Julia and David had been preparing for this night, a family gathering they believed would crown them with control. They thought they'd cornered me. They thought the old man would sign away his life with a shaky hand. I walked down the stairs of my home slowly, one hand brushing the rail Ellen once polished until it gleamed. In the living room, voices rose in cheer. Relatives filled the space, wine glasses clinking, children darting underfoot. At the long table draped in white cloth, crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier. Beside the fireplace, I had placed a photo of Ellen in her wedding dress, our family's beginning, watching over its reckoning. Julia shone in a red dress, her lipstick sharp, her smile practiced for every handshake. She greeted each cousin, each neighbor, her voice carrying, "Today is important. From now on, Father Gregory won't have to worry about a thing. David and I will handle it all." David followed close, suit crisp, jaw tight, but eyes glowing with expectation. But what made this gathering different from every birthday, every Christmas, was the pair seated quietly at the far end, Karen Davis, notary ledger on her lap, and Samuel from First National Bank, his tie neat, a stack of files under his arm. They blended with the guests, but their presence gave the room weight Julia hadn't noticed. I took my seat at the head of the table. Conversations hushed. Julia placed a leather folder in front of me, sliding it across the polished wood like a magician laying down her final card. David set a glossy blue pen beside it, his hand trembling with anticipation. "Dad," he said, his voice almost reverent, "if you sign here tonight, everything will be in place. No more worries." The room stilled. Every face turned toward me. My heart thudded, but my hand was steady. I picked up the pen, opened the folder, and scanned the page they had marked. Power of attorney. Comprehensive, irreversible. Authority over all assets, all accounts. Authority with no oversight. I felt Julia Sepp's gaze burn into me as she whispered, "Go ahead, Father Gregory. This will give you peace." And I signed. My name scrawled clearly across the bold line. Gasps rose around the table. Applause broke out, relatives clapping, as if they'd witnessed a coronation. Julia's lips stretched in triumph, her eyes flashing to David with victory. David let out a breath, shoulders sagging in relief. For a moment, they believed they had won, but I had built this stage carefully. Karen rose, her voice calm but firm. She flipped her ledger open and read aloud, "This document does not grant authority to David Hale or Julia Hale. It establishes a trust dedicated to Emily Price, granddaughter of Mr. Gregory Hale. Management rights are explicitly barred to David and Julia." The silence was instant, sharp as shattered glass. Heads turned, whispers surged. Julia's smile froze on her lips. David's face drained of color. Samuel stepped forward, placing his files on the table. 2 weeks ago, he said, his voice carrying, these two approached First National Bank, inquiring about emergency guardianship. That procedure is only used when a parent is incapacitated. They asked about binding Mr. Hale's estate under their control. He tapped the folder. "Here are the notes." Relatives leaned in, murmurs spreading. "Guardianship? Over Gregory?" one cousin whispered. "He Seps sharper than half the room." Julia Sepsis' voice cracked. "Don't Sepsis believe him. It's Sepsis fabricated. We only wanted to help." Karen Sepsis' eyes were steel. I recorded clearly. "Days ago you pressured Mr. Hale to sign a comprehensive power of attorney. He resisted." I noted signs of coercion. I stood slowly, placing another folder on the table. The paper inside rattled as I spread them. Receipts, invoices, checks. Over 3 years I have paid more than $152,000 to cover tuition, car repairs, medical bills, even a foreclosure. Each time, I believed it was my responsibility. Each time you smiled and took. And now, after bleeding me dry, you dared to prepare legal scripts to strip me entirely. The relatives' murmurs rose into a tide of disapproval. Eyes turned on Julia with contempt. David stared at the floor, his hands shaking. I looked directly at them, my voice low but cutting. "Do you know what sips worse than betrayal? Using Emily to sharpen your knife. Threatening to send her away, to fill her head with lies that her grandfather was greedy, selfish. That is not a scheme. That is cruelty." The room was silent, every eye on me, and then small footsteps sounded on the stairs. Emily, clutching her doll, her eyes red but clear, stepped into the light. Her voice trembled but carried, "Grandpa is telling the truth. I heard Mom and Dad say they would take all his money." The air cracked open. Julia turned pale as marble. David collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Relatives gasped, some shaking their heads, others muttering prayers under their breath. I opened my arms, and Emily ran into them, burying her face in my chest. I looked over her head at the family gathered before me. This is why I did what I did. Not for revenge, for protection, for truth, for honor. Applause broke again, but this time not for triumph. It was agreement, hard, sober, necessary. The curtain had fallen. The stage was bare. Julia's shoulders slumped, her eyes darting wildly, searching for an escape that wasn't there. David wept quietly, the man undone by his own weakness. And I, Gregory Hale, held my granddaughter and knew tonight was not my downfall. It was theirs. After the last clap faded and the room dissolved into murmurs, the weight of what had happened settled over everyone like dust after a collapse. Julia stood frozen, her hand still on the folder as if touching it might change the words inside. David sat hunched, shoulders shaking, his eyes darting everywhere except toward me, and Emily clung to my arm, her doll pressed between us like a shield. Relatives were the first to break the silence. My cousin Margaret, who had always adored Emily, stepped forward and shook her head at Julia. "Using a child to hurt her grandfather? Shame on you." Others followed, their whispers no longer kind but cutting. Family who once praised Julia for her hospitality now muttered about manipulation. Old friends of David shook their heads, disappointment etched in their faces. Julia tried to recover. You don't understand. Gregory is vulnerable. We were only trying to... But her voice cracked, and nobody looked convinced. They had seen enough. The bank records, the notary's testimony, the receipts. It was all too heavy to brush away with a smile. That night, after the guests trickled out, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room. The chandeliers still glowed faintly, the long table cluttered with half-empty glasses and untouched desserts. The air carried the stale mix of perfume and tension. For the first time in years I felt lighter, though exhaustion ran through my bones. Word traveled quickly in our town. By the next week, friends who once admired Julia's charm began keeping their distance. She walked into the grocery store, and neighbors turned away. The woman who used to command a room now couldn't keep her head high. David fared no better. His co-workers learned about the attempted guardianship, whispers spreading through the office halls. His reputation, once decent if unremarkable, was now stained. Even worse, creditors began circling. The mortgage was months overdue. The credit card balance of $40,000 loomed like a storm. Without my quiet bailouts, their foundation crumbled. But Emily, that sweet child, remained untouched. I made sure of it. She stayed with me more often, her laughter once again filling the halls Ellen had loved. I wanted her to know she wasn't a pawn in this cruel game. Every night I read her stories, tucked her in, and whispered promises I intended to keep. No one will take you from me. No one will make you believe lies about your grandfather. One evening, David came by alone. His shoulders sagged, his tie loosened. He stood in the doorway, eyes rimmed red. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. I never wanted it to go that far. I let him stand there, twisting his hands. "But you let it," I replied. "You stood by while Julia sharpened the knife. Silence can cut as deep as action, David." He nodded, unable to argue. For the first time, I saw not just weakness, but regret. Whether that regret would grow into change, I couldn't yet know. Julia, on the other hand, disappeared into bitterness. She stopped calling, stopped visiting, and left David to carry the weight of their debts alone. Friends she once bragged to now crossed the street to avoid her. The glittering doors she had opened with my money closed one by one. And me? For the first time in months, I could sit in my study with the safe open and not feel fear. The ledger, once a record of exploitation, had become a record of resistance. Every receipt, every note, every witness. Together they had built a wall that even greed couldn't climb. The fallout wasn't joyful. It wasn't triumphant. It was sobering. Families don't shatter with explosions. They crack with betrayal, and those cracks never quite close. But as I watched Emily chase fireflies in the yard that summer, I knew one truth: I had saved her from growing up in the shadow of lies, and that was worth more than any inheritance. Justice doesn't always arrive in a gavel's strike. Sometimes it comes in envelopes, in signatures, in the quiet authority of stamped paper. After the holiday dinner, the fallout became formal. First came the trust. Lillian, my attorney, moved swiftly. The will was rewritten, filed, and notarized. Every asset, from the house in Eugene to the savings accounts, sealed in Emily's name. The trust was structured so tightly that no guardian, no opportunistic relative could alter it. "This way," Lillian said, tapping her pen, "your granddaughter has a future, and you remain the steward, not the prey." Next, the power of attorney attempt was formally documented. Karen submitted her notes, clear and clinical, into her notary records. That ledger, bound in leather and stamped with her seal, became an iron wall. If anyone tried again to suggest I was incompetent or coerced, her testimony would stand against it. Samuel did his part too. With quiet dignity, he supplied bank correspondence showing David and Julia Seps's inquiries into guardianship. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. His documents became part of a file Lillian began to call the fortress. Julia, meanwhile, faced battles of her own making. Creditors escalated. The credit card company filed suit for unpaid balances. The mortgage company began foreclosure proceedings. Without my money flowing into their accounts, the house that once seemed like a palace turned into a cage with cracks in every wall. Friends who once came to Julia's wine nights stopped returning calls. Her social standing dissolved in whispers and avoidance. David stumbled under the weight. He confessed quietly one evening, his voice raw. "I don't know how to fix this, Dad." He admitted the debts, the endless cycle of Julia's spending, the shame of asking me for more. He didn't fight the trust. He knew the money was gone. What he faced now wasn't inheritance. It was survival. I didn't soften, but I didn't shut the door either. "Work, David, earn back your dignity. Emily deserves a father who fights for her honestly." He nodded, eyes downcast, as if the words stung and healed at the same time. The legal consequences for me were protection. For them, exposure. My accounts were safe. My estate untouchable. Their schemes had not only failed but left them vulnerable to the very system they had tried to manipulate. And through it all, Emily remained my anchor. The trust in her name wasn't just numbers on a page, it was a shield. Each clause, each safeguard, was a promise to her. She would grow up free from exploitation, free from the shadow of betrayal. That summer, when the legal filings were complete, I walked through the rose garden Ellen had planted. The air was warm, the petals heavy with bloom. I whispered to her memory, "We built walls, Ellen, not of brick, but of truth." And they held. Justice hadn't been about revenge. It had been about setting boundaries so firm that greed could not cross them. It had been about saying no, in a voice loud enough that even silence couldn't twist it. David and Julia thought they could play the system, use paperwork to strip me bare. Instead, paperwork became the very weapon that exposed them. That's the thing about justice. It doesn't roar, it doesn't boast, it stands. And in standing, it forces others to see what they've done. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel heavy anymore but steady, like a clock ticking in rhythm. After the storm of those months, I found myself sitting more often in my study, Ellen's photo propped on the desk. She was smiling in that picture, head tilted just slightly, as if she knew a secret she would tell me later. I sometimes imagined her voice still, gentle but sharp. "Watch David. He's weak." I had resisted that truth for years. I had told myself a father's duty was to believe the best, to cover debts, to excuse missteps, and perhaps I had confused love with blind faith. But in the end, Ellen had been right. My love hadn't protected David. It had weakened him, made him lean on me until he nearly toppled us both. Now the ledger lay closed, no longer a record of bleeding but of survival. Each receipt was a scar, but scars tell a story. They remind us what we endured, what we overcame. And when Emily came to sit at that same desk, her doll under her arm, I would let her flip through the copies, not to burden her, but to show her truth has weight, and it can protect you. I thought often of that night in July, the clinking glasses, the hush, when Karen read the trust aloud, the way Julia's face drained of color, the moment Emily stepped forward with her small but steady voice. That image would stay with me longer than any pain. My granddaughter had stood for truth when others had cowered. People ask me sometimes if I regret the way it ended. My son humiliated, my daughter-in-law cast out, the family fractured. Regret is the wrong word. Grief, maybe. Betrayal always leaves a shadow. But regret? No. Because I didn't fight for money. Not really. I fought for dignity, for the bond between grandfather and granddaughter, for the promise I whispered to Ellen's fading breath. Sometimes in the evening, I sit by the window with Emily, watching fireflies glow in the garden. She tells me about her school projects, about friends, about the Lego Statue of Liberty still standing in her room. And when she laughs, light and free, I know the cost was worth it. Revenge, people think, is about cruelty, about striking back. But that was never my aim. What I wanted was justice, justice that sets boundaries, justice that says no one, not even family, has the right to steal a man's life from under him. I whispered to Ellen's photo one night. I didn't strike for revenge, but for Emily's truth, and I felt, for the first time in years, at peace. They thought they had fooled me, thought they could dress greed in the language of care. But in the end, truth outlived deceit. That is the lesson I carry, and the one I hope Emily carries too. So when people ask how it ended, I say this: they thought they took me for a fool, but you don't lose me. You gave me away. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. My house no longer felt like a fortress under siege, but like a home again. The roses Ellen planted along the porch bloomed thick and fragrant, and each morning I walked the rows with Emily, showing her how to clip the spent blooms so new ones would grow. David tried, in his own stumbling way, to rebuild. He came by occasionally, shoulders slumped, voice low. The bravado he once carried, the kind Julia inflated with her schemes, was gone. He picked up extra shifts at his job, started selling off the luxuries they had piled onto credit. I watched him struggle, part of me bitter, part of me quietly hoping this hardship would carve strength where weakness had lived. Julia, though, vanished into her debts. She left their home one night, taking little more than her clothes and a handful of jewelry. Word drifted back that she had moved 2 towns over, working part-time at a consignment shop. Friends who once praised her style now whispered about her fall. She had built her world on appearances, and without my money propping her up, that world collapsed. The house David once bragged about lost its shine. The mortgage company circled, and eventually he moved into a smaller place, humbler but his own. It wasn't what Julia had envisioned, but perhaps it was what David needed: a roof earned, not borrowed. As for me, I turned my focus where it belonged, on Emily. She came every weekend, her laughter filling rooms that had once echoed with suspicion. We built Lego towers, baked Ellen's old cookie recipes, sat under the oak tree with books. Slowly, I watched her innocence return. The shadows of that July night faded, replaced by the steadiness of safety. Neighbors sometimes asked how I managed to endure the betrayal. I told them the truth. Endurance wasn't the point. Protection was. You don't survive storms by pretending they won't come. You build strong walls and shelter those who matter. When I looked at Emily running barefoot through the grass, I knew my choice had been the right one. Betrayal may have cracked my family, but it had also made clear who I was meant to guard. And in that clarity, I found peace. It was late autumn when the postcard arrived. The envelope was thin, the handwriting uneven but unmistakable. I stood at the kitchen counter, the smell of fresh coffee rising, and stared at the Seattle postmark. My hands didn't tremble. By then the storm had passed, but a weight still pressed against my chest as I slid the card free. The picture on the front showed the Space Needle lit against a dusky sky, a cheap tourist print. On the back, just a few lines in Julia Sepp's looping script. Gregory, I hope you're well. I'm working at a diner downtown, pouring coffee, trying to make ends meet. Life turned out differently than I planned. Julia. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just the bare bones of a fall. I stood there a long time, tracing the ink with my thumb. This was the woman who once floated in silk dresses at dinner parties, who boasted of vacations in Napa and Italian handbags. The woman who told me, with a smile sweet as poison, that I was too old to manage my affairs. Now she carried trays and poured coffee for strangers, her charm wasted on customers who didn't know her schemes. I folded the card once, twice, and tucked it into my ledger, not out of spite, but because it belonged with the rest of the story, another receipt of betrayal, stamped in ink instead of numbers. David never spoke of her again. He showed up sometimes with Emily, quieter now, thinner but working. I watched him mow his own lawn at the smaller house he'd moved into, sweat dripping down his face, and for the first time in years I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe losing everything had stripped him down to the truth. Maybe weakness could turn to strength when the scaffolding of lies finally fell. But Julia had built her castle out of other people's labor, other people's trust, and when the walls collapsed, she discovered she had no foundation of her own. As for me, I sat on the porch with Emily that evening, the postcard still fresh in my mind. She leaned against me, a book open in her lap, her hair catching the last light of the day. I thought of Ellen then, how she would have smiled to see our granddaughter safe, her future secured. And I whispered into the dusk, not to Julia, not to David, but to the memory of my wife, we didn't lose. They gave us away. Because in the end, betrayal isn't about what is taken, it's about what you refuse to surrender. My fortune wasn't just money, it was dignity, legacy, love, and those remained mine. Julia thought she could rewrite my life with a single signature, but the truth is, she rewrote her own, with every greedy demand, every false smile, every whispered plan. And her ending wasn't written in gold or silk. It was written in ink on a diner's time card,